So Dan and I are going to talk about worldviews. I'm going to start off with a couple of quotes, actually. Number one is from C.S. Lewis. To be ignorant and simple now, not to be able to meet the enemy on his own ground, would be to throw down our weapons and betray our uneducated brethren who have under God no defense but us against the attacks of the intellectual heathen. Good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered. And from G.K. Chesterton, the point of having an open mind is like having an open mouth to close it on something solid. In the 1980s, a guy by the name of Alan Bloom, have you ever heard of him? He wrote a book called The Closing of the American Mind, all right? And in this book, he essentially said this, that as a general rule, all great societies, or all societies, are based on a great story, all right? For example, Arab culture today exists the way it does because over the centuries, people there have grown up with the stories of the Quran. Similarly, Western society looks somewhat the way it does because over the centuries people grew up with, or should I say used to grow up with, the stories of the Bible, all right? And he says this, it doesn't even have to be ancient religious texts. Like take pagan societies, for example, like the ancient Polynesians or the pre-Christian Europeans. And by pagan, I don't mean a derogatory term either. By pagan, I just mean a society whose great book is the book of nature. All right? He also goes on to say this, that when a society is cut off from its great story, the society will persist for some time bearing the likeness of that story. For example, take India again. He would say that in India, even though people now don't often read the stories of the Mahabharata, the concepts of loyalty to family and performing one's karmic duty and even the caste system are still very alive in that country. Do you know what I mean? Even though they're not reading the religious texts anymore. Let's take Canada. One of the things I did before doing first of all, I did a lot of work with CMDS in medical school. Then I left CMDS and I did a lot of work with an organization called the ICMDA, or the International Christian Medical and Dental Association. People ask me what that is, and essentially it's the big CMDS that all the little CMDSs belong to. Like CMDS is Canadian, but believe it or not, in many, many countries there's the equivalent of CMDS. All right, and they all sort of are members of this big organization that has international conferences and stuff like that. In fact, where's the next World Congress? Holland, is it? So if you guys the first one Joe and I went to was in Durban, South Africa. After that, it was in Taiwan. After that, it was in Sydney, Australia. The last one was in Uruguay, and the next one's in Holland. And every 4 years, imagine this student conference, but massive, and from people from all over the world, Christian docs. Anyhow, something to think about. The next one's in Holland, and it's in the year 2014. All right, and CMDS used to have anyway, scholarships for that.
We haven't but we will by then.
There it is, you see? Yeah, and in fact, some years CMDS has had scholarships that people haven't even applied for. All right, so there you go. Anyhow, so I did a lot of work with ICMDA. I've traveled a fair bit, and whenever I talk to other Christians from other parts of the world, they always say stuff to me like, geez, Mark, you're lucky. You live in a Christian country. Of course your police don't take bribes. Of course you have social programs. Of course you have of course you have freedom of speech. All right? I tell them something to the effect of, well, I guess Canada used to be a Christian country. I mean, after all, our name is what? It's the Dominion of Canada, right? And our motto is even Amariusque Admer, which means from sea to sea. Both of those things are taken from Psalm 78:2, and he shall have dominion from sea to sea, all right? So even built into our nation's name is the concept of the sovereignty of God. I'm from the Maritimes. You guys nobody from here from the Maritimes. But if you go to Province House in PEI, where I guess sat the Fathers of Confederation all those years ago, you'll see this sentence. It says here, in the hearts of the delegates who assembled in this room on September 1st, 1864, was born the Dominion of Canada. Providence being their guide, they built it better than they knew. That's in PEI, the Fathers of Confederation. Unfortunately, I then go on to tell them how Christianity is often now mocked in the movies, mocked from our television screens, mocked from university lecture halls, and sometimes even from church pulpits. See how things have changed even in the last 50 years. I bet when your parents were growing up, I'll try this on you guys, I bet they could come up to somebody out in the street and say this, the first line to a song, finished a song, "Veiled in flesh the Godhead see." Deity. And they was, did you guys all know that? And they would have known that the line after that was, "Hail the incarnate deity." The reason why they would have known that is because most of them had known the Christmas carol what? "Hark the herald angels sing." They may not have known what it meant. What in the world's a herald angel? You know what I mean? But they would have at least known, they would have known the words, all right? Or if you had said to somebody at that time, "Why that woman has the patience of Job." Do you know what I mean? They would have understood that content. Many people even today believe that in order to plumb the depths of English literature, a working knowledge of the Bible is necessary. I think it was Keats who used this line in one of his poems. John Patrick says this. Keats says, "Standing amid the alien corn." It's in one of his poems. And somebody back then, Keats' audience, would have immediately known that he was referring to the story of Ruth. All right? And because of that one line, would have immediately imported into the story the concepts of abandonment, poverty, family, kinship, redemption, and salvation. Do you know what I mean? All from that one line. It was a rich language back then, you know? You guys, any history buffs, I know Dan and I talk about history sometimes, but at the beginning of World War II, when the British Expeditionary Force, this is before the Americans and Canadians, when the British Expeditionary Force was in Europe trying to defend France and Belgium, they were being beaten back by the Germans, and they made a stand in the town of Dunkirk, all right, in Belgium. And the whole world watched, thinking that they were going to see the annihilation of 300,000 British and French soldiers. The British soldiers sent by wireless one message back to England. It was 3 words. The 3 words were, "But if not." Have you guys heard that? But if not, all right? And they immediately knew what that meant. You know, it was taken from the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all right? Where it says something to the effect of, "Be it known to you, O King Nebuchadnezzar, our God is powerful enough to save us from the fiery furnace. But if not, we shall not bend the knee," right? All in 3 words. John Patrick goes on to say that he's done a lot of work in Africa. He's gone on to say that he actually has more faith in Africa in some ways than in North America, because he likens them to being new Christians in a dying pagan story, whereas we're new pagans in a dying Christian story in Canada. My pastor actually told me one time that he likens Canadian society almost to enjoying the shade of a tree that's dying. You know what I mean? Anyhow, my point is this, is that your peers in medical school probably don't see the world the way you do, right? The categories that they use to interpret and process life's events are probably different. In other words, now they have a different worldview. Have you guys heard that term, worldview? Let me bring up this one slide here. All right, worldview. There's many different definitions. I guess you think about it as the lens through which somebody looks at the world. I found this online. Here's what it says. The composite set of presuppositions, beliefs, and values a person possesses that shape how he or she sees reality and determines how he or she will act. It refers to the collective set of fundamental convictions people hold and on which they base their actions. You guys all have a worldview, and your peers all have a worldview, whether you believe it or not, or whether you've thought about it or not. For example, when you guys are doing experiments in your undergrad, and you saw an anomalous blip of data, how many of you guys believe that that may have been because of fairies? Do you know what I mean? Or when you guys came here, how many of you thought that when you came here that you might get eaten by a dinosaur? Do you know what I mean? No, none of you, because you've never articulated this, but those concepts are not part of your worldview. All right? So whether or not you think about your worldview, you have one. And I'm going to go as far as saying this. The most important thing about your worldview is what you think about God. All right? It doesn't even matter what it is. It doesn't even matter if you think there's no, I'm not saying that you believe in God, but even if part of your worldview is that you don't believe in God, that's probably the most important part of your worldview, because it will set everything up, okay? Your very approach to life will change based on that belief. Why are Dan and I going to spend so much time doing this today? It's because we think that understanding your own worldview and the worldview of your peers is critical for 2 things. 1, sharing the gospel with them, all right? And number 2, being a Christian doctor. Not just, and as somebody said today, not a doctor who is a Christian, but a Christian who's a doctor, an actual bona fide Christian doctor. And I don't think I'm just talking about academics here, all right? I think this is real stuff. I found this quote. Dan, I'm going to use it, okay? It's Viktor Frankl. I use this one all the time. It's about ideas having consequences. Viktor Frankl, the philosopher and historian. If we present man with a concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him. When we present him as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drive and reactions, as a mere product of heredity in the environment, we feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and the environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or the other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Ideas have consequences, or as John Patrick used to say, people are logical, but slowly. All right, you will eventually live out your ideas. If asked, a lot of us probably don't even know why we're Christian. I mean, what I hear, this is what, you guys know how this works. Like somebody will ask, why are you a Christian? And instead of answering with why we're a Christian, we'll answer more something like how we became a Christian. Do you know what I mean? It's like, why are you a Christian? Well, I was in university, and then these people from Campus Crusade came, and they invited me out, so I decided to go to one of their meetings, and there was a great speaker, and we sang some songs, and they made a call, and then I'm a Christian. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what that sounds like to somebody who's not a Christian? That sounds like brainwashing, all right? Not only does it sound like brainwashing, in fact, it sounds kind of random. Like, what if you were approached by the Muslim Students Association that day? Do you know what I mean? Would you be a Muslim? It's amazing how many of us don't even understand why we believe the things that we believe. I think the greatest example of this worldview evangelism is Paul, especially in Athens. So I'm going to read just a little bit. Acts 17, 16 to 31 is where I'm reading from. Don't bother looking it up. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was, I had once somebody said, where is, I was talking about where a passage was, and it was in Romans, and the guy said, I know that, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Romans. Anyway, but I'll read from Acts 17. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Okay, think about where we are. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, which would be like the Supreme Court here in Canada, where they said to him, may we know this new teaching that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I can see that in every way you are a very religious people, or as you would tell your peers, a very spiritual people, right? For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands, and he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out to him and find him, though he is not far from any of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set the day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. He knew the worldviews around him understood them, and brought those to the people where they discussed those things. Evangelism used to be sharing a relatively small part of the biblical worldview, all right, specifically around the propitiation, all right? I was one of the only guys that had a car. Deanna and I were talking about this in medical school. I had a beat-up Mercury Topaz. This thing was a Molotov cocktail on wheels. But I used to drive this thing, okay? And my fiance lived in Hamilton, and Dan and I lived Dan's wife lived in Hamilton, right? And I would got this car, man, by the end of medical school, this car knew the way to Hamilton. I'd go and I'd just say, Hamilton, the car, you know what I mean? But I used to run this thing that I used to call tongue-in-cheek Chandra Airways, all right? And it was an airline in the form of a beat-up Mercury Topaz that drove from Kingston through to Toronto to Hamilton. And because Dan drove Chandra Airways sometimes, but a lot of times I managed to have a lot of my friends and classmates on board Chandra Airways with me, so I had them locked into like a 4-hour conversation. Do you know what I mean? And one of the things I was trying to do with all these classmates, is a cross-section of my class, was trying to share the gospel, telling them a little bit about the Bible. And here's what I found, is that the whole thing about me presenting that small aspect of the Christian story didn't work anymore. Like, not only could we not agree on what was good and evil, we couldn't even agree that there was such a thing as good and evil. Do you know what I mean? In order for me to adequately share the gospel with them, I had to go right back to the beginning. You know, worldview. Start talking about the creation, and then the fall, and then the curse, and the concept of good and evil, and redemption, and then what Christ did. You know what I mean? I had to go back and do the whole thing with them. You know, as Don Carson would say, he's a Christian apologist, he would say, Jesus, 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 yes, but in the context of the greater Christian worldview. All right? So anyhow, Dan and I are going to talk about a couple of worldviews today. How many, Dan? 5. Okay. The first one we're going to talk about is modernism. All right? Everybody have coffee? All right? All right, just stay with me here, all right? We're going to get through this. We're getting to the end, and I say that to give you hope, okay? So let's talk about the ones that you're going to commonly find in medical school, okay? The first one I'm going to talk about is modernism. And I want you guys to pay attention here, because worldviews typically have to answer 4 big questions. Here's what they are, all right? Origin. Where did everything come from, and why is it the way it is? All right. Number 2, morality. How do I know what's right and wrong? There is such a thing as right and wrong. Number 3, meaning. Is there any purpose or meaning to anything or my life? And number 4, destiny. What happens when I die? All right. In many ways, worldviews have to answer these 4 questions. Let's talk about one, modernism. Okay. And I'll change the slide to this here. Okay. Now, I'm going to try to keep this as interesting as Dan and I live here. We find it interesting, but I'm going to try to keep it so interesting for you guys. Just take that coffee IV if you have to, okay? Just have to. Okay. There was a period of time after the Middle Ages. It was a long time that we called it the Renaissance. Okay, it began in about the mid-16th century. All right, and it was over centuries a period of time of slow intellectual and educational reform. All right. It ended at a period called the Enlightenment period. Have you guys heard about that? It ended in, you guys probably know way more about this than me, but it ended in something called the Enlightenment period. I suppose the man who kicked off the Enlightenment period would be a guy called Francis Bacon. All right. And he essentially said that man would use science to gain knowledge, and we would use this knowledge to gain power over nature. All right. That was essentially his thesis. Enlightenment thinkers essentially believed 3 things, and this is what they were. Number 1, an objective body of knowledge exists and is waiting to be discovered, all right? Number 2, that this body of knowledge is neutral and value-free, all right? And number 3, that discovering this knowledge would help all of mankind. As you can see, it was a pretty optimistic time, this age of reason, all right? In fact, you know, let's face it, the Enlightenment period essentially led to modern science as we now understand it. I suppose it reached a heyday in the period of Sir Isaac Newton. At that time, you know, nature was quantifiable, it was exact, it was predictable. And under this model, scientific knowledge exploded. Like just take, I like astronomy. Just take for the first time, you know, Western Europeans were finally able to meet and in fact surpass the astronomical knowledge of the Aztecs and the Egyptians. Do you know what I mean? Under this new approach to knowledge. A key thing here to know, though, is that these early Enlightenment thinkers were not pure materialists. Do you guys know what I mean by that? All right? I'm going to use three terms pretty interchangeably here, Dan and I will. They are, you'll commonly hear it as atheists. I'm sure there's an atheist club in your school, right? You know what I mean? A lot of them have that, right? But the term, I guess the proper term that would be either naturalists or materialists. They mean more or less the same thing. A naturalist would simply feel that nature is all there is. The time, space, and matter is all that there is, all right? And that there's nothing what? Supernatural, okay? That would be a naturalist. Another term of that would be a materialist, meaning that the material universe is all that there is, all right? It's important to note that the first thinkers about this were not that, all right? They actually thought that not only would science be used to help us come up with scientific knowledge, but it could also be used to better mankind in terms of moral knowledge as well. All right? It wasn't until the later thinkers that you start seeing some naturalists and atheists emerging, but even they were on the fringe, all right? But it wasn't, that is until, I think the year was 1868, Charles Darwin published what? On the Origin of Species, all right? And in many ways, that sort of made the world safe for atheists, all right? As Thomas Huxley said, he said that Charles Darwin has made atheism intellectually respectable. You know what I mean? Interesting, eh? So that was later on. You guys probably heard a lot about that in biology class and stuff. What were the name of the 3 ships again that he sailed on? No, the Beagle was the name of his ship. I'm thinking about Christopher Columbus. That's how much I know about history. Anyway, all right. So after the Enlightenment period, that's when we sort of enter the modern period proper. Why they called it the modern period, I don't know. Why would you ever do that? Let's call this time the modern time. All right? Because now you're stuck. What do you call what comes after the modern time? You call it postmodern, which is even weirder. So then what do you call what comes after that? Anyway, they called it the modern time. People say, what was the modern time characterized by? It was essentially the Enlightenment time minus the optimism. Where did the optimism went? It sort of vanished into some pretty violent revolutions in Europe and the First World War and stuff like that. So the common thing with the modern thinkers was this. It was sort of a time of abandoning tradition and old ideas and institutions, including the idea that reason would save mankind. Do you know what I mean? That sort of a pie-in-the-sky approach seemed to have gone away. How you guys will commonly encounter modernism right now is through the atheists in your class. In fact, in a lot of ways, modernism is really popular now. Like, who are the main guys in the new atheist movement? Right around them, like Richard Dawkins, right? He wrote The God Delusion, right? Who's the other guys? The guy that makes him look tame, Christopher Hitchens, right? And Sam Harris. If you've read, you've probably seen some of their debates and stuff like that. These are the guys that will make Christians cry. Do you know what I mean? It's a lot of stuff going on in the new atheist movement right now. So anyway, it's kind of topical. Let's just look at I've called it scientific naturalism here as opposed to modernism because I think it'll create a better image in your mind. By scientific naturalism, I mean that science is all that there is and that there's no supernatural. All right? You can easily put atheism or modernism in there. So, origin. Okay, number 1. All right? And this is not new stuff that I'm coming up with. You guys probably know about it. So what would be the scientific naturalist understanding of origin? Number 1, the universe has either always existed or began a finite time ago through what we commonly refer to as the Big Bang. All right? Or as Carl Sagan said, remember his show Cosmos, the book he wrote, Cosmos? All right? He said, his famous quote is, "The cosmos is all that there ever was, is, and will be." Right? All there is space, matter, and time. Carl Sagan. Why do this day modernists have a hard time with this? All right? Because what does it sound like? Have you heard the concept of creation ex nihilo? All right? As Ted Koppel said, the reason why atheists didn't like Big Bang cosmology was what? Because Ted Koppel said, all bangs have bangers, therefore big bangs have big bangers. All right? Have you heard about that? So to this day, a stumbling block for many atheists in your class or wherever is, how did all this get started? Essentially, if I was to take Big Bang cosmology and break it down, it would be, first there was nothing, nothing exploded, and then we got everything. Do you see what I mean? So anyhow, there's the thing. So creation ex nihilo is something that scientific naturalists struggle with. Number 2, and they may disagree with some of these things, but I think if you follow my track, you will see how what I'm saying makes sense. Okay, number two, what's their take on morality? Here's what I'm going to say is this. If you are going to be an intellectually honest scientific naturalist or atheist, the conclusion would be what? That there's no such thing as good and evil. Why do I say that? All right, because of this. If the Big Bang cosmology is correct and naturalism is correct, all that there is forces and particles in the universe, obeying the laws of physics. If that's all that there is, okay, then where did moral absolutes come from? And I'm talking about moral absolutes, objective morality, not arbitrarily attributed morality, but objective morality. If there is such a thing truly as things that are good and truly things that are evil, and I mean objective, I mean things like this. Objective morality would be like if I was to say the Holocaust was wrong. If that was an objective moral statement, it means that the Holocaust was wrong even if everybody in this room thought it was right. Do you guys see what I mean by objective morality? If objective morality exists in the scientific framework, then that means that the Big Bang spewed out moral absolutes just like it did neutrons. Do you see what I mean? So it follows naturally from a purely naturalistic view of the world that I'm not so sure how there can be such a thing as objective good and evil based on the modernistic view of the world. Okay? That's number one. In other words, it's this, like, science is very good at telling us what is, but it's very poor at telling us what ought to be. Science can tell you how my hand works, but it has no capacity to tell you whether it's good. Do you see what I mean? If an asteroid crashes into the moon, is that a good or bad event? My suggestion to you is that it's actually neither. All right? In fact, the question doesn't make sense in the modernist naturalistic worldview. So morality. Coming from this would be this. All right? Meaning. Is there any such meaning? With a purely naturalistic view, I'm not so sure how things can have objective meaning. In fact, I'm not even sure how you can have free will. All right? Because I have a degree in physics. So I'm not just sort of saying this. All right? But I've done a lot of problem analysis in physics, and I can tell you guys that we've analyzed some pretty complex systems, and not once during that analysis did I factor in there what the particles wanted to do. Do you guys see what I mean? So if scientific naturalism is all that there is, that tells me that if I knew enough about the orientation and vectors of the particles early in the creation of the universe, or even now, I would be able to predict everything from this point on. Or if you're a quantum theorist, at least bring it down to probabilities. Do you guys see what I mean? All right, so meaning. If all I am is the random collocation of atoms, why should you believe anything that I'm saying? Because it's a random collocation of atoms spewing out a random collocation of atoms. It's like, let's say you were in Japan right now, and the earthquake and all the stuff going on blew together a sign that said Toronto, 10 kilometers. Would you believe what that sign said? Absolutely not, right? If it came about randomly. So that's meaning. And last one here, destiny. After death, what would come? Nothing. Okay, so that's modernism, and then quickly through postmodernism. Alan Bloom, he said this also in his book, The Closing of the American Mind. There is one thing that a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes or says he believes that truth is relative. So we're moving on to postmodernism now. If this belief is put to the test, one can count on the students' reaction. They will be uncomprehending. That anyone would regard the proposition as not self-evident astonishes them, as though he were calling into question 2 + 2 = 4. I suppose it would be Immanuel Kant's book, A Critique of Pure Reason, that may have spelled the beginning of the end of modernism. In this, Kant admits that reason alone cannot, and science alone cannot give us information on things that aren't purely physical, like good and bad and stuff like that. Instead, he felt that each one of us has inside of us a moral compass, all right, that we could get at through meditation and self-reflection and analyzing things that would lead us to good and evil. I remember as a medical student, I was kind of sympathetic towards Kant and his deontology. We talked about him in ethics class, right, Dan? But, listen to this, though. I found this quote by Iris Murdoch talking about that Kantian view. How recognizable, how familiar to us is the man so beautifully portrayed by Kant, who when confronted even with Christ turns away to consider the judgment of his own conscience and to hear the voice of his own reason. Stripped of the minimal metaphysical background which Kant was prepared to allow him, this man is still with us, Free, independent, lonely, powerful, rational, responsible, brave, the hero of many novels and books in moral philosophy. The raison d'etre of this attractive but misleading creature is not far to seek. He is the offspring of the age of science, confidently rational, and yet increasingly aware of his alienation from the material universe which his discoveries reveal. His alienation is without cure. It is not a long step from Kant to Nietzsche, to existentialism, to the Anglo-Saxon ethical doctrines which in some way closely resemble it. In fact, Kant's man has already received a glorious incarnation nearly a century earlier in the work of Milton. His proper name is Lucifer. All right? And Ravi Zacharias says this. Let's not fool ourselves. We're all human here. All right? The injunction to love our neighbors as ourselves is not a statement of the obvious. It is a commandment. Right? And it is a commandment that only makes sense because it follows the commandment before it, love thy God. And in turn, that all makes sense because it again is preceded with, I am the Lord your God who led you out of slavery in Egypt. I guess who would come after that? It would be Friedrich Nietzsche, I suppose, and some would consider him the patron saint of postmodernism. I don't know about that for sure. But he was an existentialist and a nihilist. He essentially believed this, and it's a bit hard to understand. I've read some of his stuff and it's kind of depressing, but he would suggest this. There's no absolute truth, only relative truth born of power, all right? Hence his will to power that he talks about. He said that this idea would begin to permeate Western culture because God had died in our culture, all right? And by that he meant that the modern Western mind, through scientific naturalism, had sort of done away with God. And without something like God to take its place, all right, particularly the Christian God, which he didn't like, all right, there would be no real truth, just power. And that man was essentially a set of survival instincts. And without some Christian worldview or something like that to stand in its way, then the powerful people would begin to dominate the weak people, right? And he said that if that wouldn't be natural, then it would be good. Do you know what I mean? And it's amazing stuff you should read, that there's no truth. We create truth to suit ourselves, all right? One thing you got to say about him is in many ways he seemed like honest, you know what I mean, in his analysis of the whole thing. The definition of postmodernism is elusive, and like I said, I think the name is ridiculous, all right? If I could go back and say, why'd you call it modernism? Because now we have to deal with something called postmodernism. So now we're living in a period that isn't modern, do you know what I mean? It's kind of weird. But anyway, it is elusive, but there's essentially, you guys can take this home, I think, 3 pillars of postmodernism, all right? Here's what they are. And I think that in many ways, these may, when we talk about postmodernism, I may be talking about where most of your classmates are right now. That's just a guess, all right? Here, this would be the 3 pillars of postmodernism. Number 1, relativism, okay? Number 2, pluralism. And number 3, the disdain for the meta-narrative. All right, that's complicated. Let's take that one first. You guys know what I mean? You guys know what I mean by narrative. It's a story, right? In fact, postmoderns love stories, especially ambiguous and symbol-laden ones, that are hard to interpret, okay? Tell me your Christian story. What's your story? You know what I mean? Narrative. What postmoderns don't like is the concept of the meta-narrative, okay? You guys know what I mean by metastatic? What if cancer is What if cancer is static? What does it mean? If your cancer is static, it means it hasn't moved, right? Let's say you have lung cancer, right? Carcinoma in situ, it's just right there. All right? If cancer is metastatic, meta means beyond, okay? So metastatic cancer is cancer that has moved beyond the static, okay? What postmoderns really disdain is the concept of the meta-narrative, all right? So if you suggest that you actually know the meta-narrative, the story that explains all the little stories, do you see what I mean? You guys all have a Christian testimony, but without the Christian meta-narrative, your little testimony actually doesn't mean anything. Do you see what I mean? It makes sense in the context of the grand meta-narrative, all right? And postmoderns always struggle with that concept that we would claim to know a big story that explains all the little stories, all right? So that would be pillar number 1, all right? Disdain for the meta-narrative. The person who came up with that term was actually a French philosopher by the name of Jean-François Lyotard, all right? Some people say that you'll see a lot of the postmodern philosophers are actually French. Some people would suggest that postmodernism actually began in the year 1968 during the student riots at the Sorbonne in Paris. And a lot of the postmodernist concepts and writing came out from that period. Anyhow, having the disdain for the meta-narrative, Christianity is in many ways written off, all right, by postmoderns. And I think this should give all Christians pause, because I think if nothing else, the Bible is a great story. It is the meta-narrative. So disdain for the meta-narrative. Number 2, pluralism, all right? And I don't want to say that pluralism is in all cases bad. I'm the product of pluralism. We're near Toronto right now. A friend of mine said that you can go to Toronto and find a Korean man selling kosher tacos. Do you know what I mean? A marvelous expression of pluralism, right? So I'm not here to say that pluralism is bad. But pluralism taken in the postmodern way would be this. Pluralism would say that there is a number of competing worldviews, but no one worldview is allowed to be dominant. In other words, it's wrong to challenge somebody else's truth claim. All right? That would be an example of pluralism. With pluralism, I guess it's really hard to speak out about some things in your class, because as soon as you try to do that, you'll be immediately labeled as being paternalistic. You guys heard that before? I don't know about you, I'm a family doctor. I always tell people that, you know, I learned how not to be paternalistic in medical school, and right now I spend almost all day being paternalistic. You know what I mean? What am I, with patients coming, what are we saying, you know? Don't smoke, don't drink, you know, eat better, exercise more. Do you know what I mean? I was like, holy smoke, I'm doing all this stuff I was told not to in medical school. Anyway, you probably heard that all the time. All right, and pluralism, by the way, is ancient. I was listening to another Don Carson lecture, and he says this. I didn't know this, but pluralism was even embraced by the ancient Romans. When they conquered a land, all right, not only did they conquer the land, but they actually had a god swap. And there was a really good strategic reason for that. Meaning that if you were conquered, they would take some of your gods and you would end up taking on part of the Roman pantheon. The reason why they knew this and they used it to their advantage is they had seen that all successful rebellions in history are because people were able to line up 3 things: people, land, and God. If you could get a critical mass of people with the same ethnic heritage on their land with their God, you would have a very powerful rebellion on your hands. But by doing the God swap and moving, people were free to move around the empire. It was very hard to line that up now, all right? Because some people were here, some were there, so you couldn't really line up people. Land maybe, but not God, because you'd swapped gods. You were pluralistic. Whose side was God on in this rebellion? Do you see what I mean? Like the stuff that's happening in Libya now. It's sort of the religious worldview at stake there is Islam, but since both sides are Islamic, you don't really hear a lot about that in the news. It's not really about Islam. It's more about societal things and culture and rights as opposed to religion. Anyway, interesting. So pluralism. And number 3 is relativism. Relativism simply says that all truth is relative. The next time somebody tells you that there's no such thing as truth, what do you ask them? Is that statement true? All right, is what you do. As I heard somebody say once, when somebody tells you there's no such thing as truth, they're asking you not to believe them, so don't. All right, so anyhow, so that would be relativism, pluralism, and disdain for the meta-narrative. Let me just move in here. So let's break it down then into these questions. Postmodernism. This is easy. Origin, pick your story. All right? If it lines up with observable facts, good. If it doesn't, better. All right? Origin, pick your story. All right? Number 2, morality. Good and evil are what? Are relative. That being said, though, you'd be amazed at how many of your postmodern peers are some of the most absolutist people you will ever meet. All right? I remember in Kingston, when I was going to medical school, there was actually a group called Medical Students for Openness, or something like that. I can't remember what it was called. And one time I decided to go to this Medical Students for Openness meeting, and let me tell you, it was anything but open. All right? You better have a fairly liberal worldview to be welcomed at this meeting. And this was done under the guise of Medical Students for Openness. All right, in Kingston. So anyway, good and evil are relative in this morality. Okay, number 2. And you know what, another thing, it's like, I got to tell this one story about John Patrick. He was marking some papers. He's a pediatrician in Ottawa, where he used to be. And all these people handed him his papers, and they were talking about morality, and there was a staunch moral relativist in his class. He hands John his paper. John takes his paper, he puts all the others in the stack, puts a big 0 on his, and gives it back to the guy, right? John actually did this, right? And the guy goes, "What are you doing? You haven't even read it. It's not fair. It's wrong," right? And John said, "Are you trying to tell me that there's such a thing as good and evil that's objective?" Right? And the guy stops for a second. Like, he looked at John as if he had just played the ace of trumps and it wasn't enough to win. Do you know what I mean? But he gave no, and then John took his paper, "Thank you very much," and put it back in his stack. Fascinating. Ask John to tell you about that sometime. Anyhow, meaning, all meaning would be personal in nature, all right? And then finally, destiny. Again, pick your story, all right? What happens after you die. I'm going to end off with this, and then it's Dan's turn. I'm right at 42 minutes, Dan, so I think we're going to be okay. I heard, again, Ravi Zacharias give this story. It's called The Creed of the Atheist. You guys ever heard it? Maybe? Written by a guy called Steve Turner. It's not just the creed of the atheist. It seems to be the creed of so many of the people that I went to school with. All right? It was published in a British newspaper. The Creed of the Atheist. He says this: "We believe in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay as long as you don't hurt anyone to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that adultery is fun. We believe that sodomy is okay. We believe that taboos are taboo. We believe that everything's getting better despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated, and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe that there's something in horoscopes, UFOs, and bent spoons. We believe that Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Mohammed, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think his good morals were really bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same, at least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end, and if the dead have lied, then it is compulsorily heaven be for all, excepting perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average, what's average is normal, what's normal is good. We believe in total disarmament. We believe that there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors, and the Russians would be sure to follow. We believe that man is essentially good. It's only his behavior that lets him down. This is the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions. Conditions is the fault of society. We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him. Reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust. History will alter. We believe that there is no absolute truth except the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the rejection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought." And he ends with this postscript: "If chance be the father of all flesh, then disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, troops on rampage, youths go looting, bomb blasts school, it is but the sound of man worshiping his maker." The Creed of the Atheist, Steve Turner. At that, Dan, that's Worldviews, Modernism, and Postmodernism. Dano. Here we go.
So Mark has taken you to the 1980s. So my job is to move you from the 80s to 2011. And you can tell that time moves faster as we go forward because, you know, modernism was a few hundred years and postmodernism a few decades, and now we're talking about a dozen years. So we'll conclude, so we're going to do that, and then I'll conclude with how an individual worldview actually changes. And there's some active debate about whether a new worldview is actually emerging from the destruction of the modern worldview that postmodernity rocked. Right? So modern worldview gets established, postmodernity comes along and totally wrecks it, and what are you going to do? You still got to live your life, you still got to choose what you're going to eat for breakfast, and you can't do that if you've got nothing. So some people think that what's emerged in the last 20 years is another worldview that'll make sense of it, and other people think that it's still just philosophers groping in the dark to come up with something, and in a couple hundred years we'll know if it's a worldview or not. But that worldview has been called postmodernism, so it gets really silly, or it's called the global worldview. And the global worldview is a combination of local and global. And one of the main themes here is that people are dealing with being local people aware of a global situation. So part of what's going on is you've got modernity, which was nice and firm, postmodernity blows it all up, and now you got nothing, so how do you live your life? And also you've got all this technology and migration, global corporations, global systems, geography's becoming rather irrelevant. You've got local cultures, you've got regional cultures, you've got national cultures, you've got global cultures, they're all in conflict, changes everywhere, and yet people are yearning for stability. People are moving all around the planet, and yet they yearn for home. Capitalism rules the world. There's really no other economic system that functions anywhere on the planet anymore, except on local scales. And religions are conflicting with each other, and religions are conflicting with secularism. And all of this stuff is happening, and you've got to figure out how do you make sense of the world. So you've got all these conditions happening. Where do you go with that? How do you build a worldview? One of the responses is we make sense of it by constructing yet another worldview. And people have begun that process a little bit. So some scholars think there's a vacuum left behind. We've got to build a worldview. And the purpose of this worldview will be to deal with all the problems that we see in the world around us. So let's build a useful worldview. And you'll see that this is very much the worldview of the engineer, of the tinkerer, of the person that's trying to fix problems, which is where we're at. So there is this postmodern critique of modernity. What do we do with that? There's globalism. There's no dominant culture, right? We can't go to, there's no meta-narrative anymore. We can't go to that to go, we can't go to a dominant culture because there isn't one of those anymore, or at least there shouldn't be. And everything is changing so fast that it's just hard to keep up. And so how are we going to figure out what is true in such a context? So I'm going to work through, and it took me a slide with each one of them, whereas Mark managed to do it all in one slide. But ultimate meaning. So they get at meaning through two sort of mechanisms. The first is critical realism. So modernity said there is an objective truth out there, and our task is to understand it. Postmodernity said, no, there's no objective truth. There's only these models that we construct in our mind that come from our power, that help us preserve power. That's what it is. So the global worldview says, you know what? There is absolute truth out there, but you're right, the models we construct of that truth are somewhat inaccurate because of the things in us that block our ability to see that clearly. So modernity wanted to build models. Modernity said, this is the solar system, and then you built your little planetarium, and your planetarium was trying to exactly mimic the solar system, right? Why? So that you could launch a rocket off the Earth and put it in orbit around Mercury, which we did this week, right? You could travel the millions of miles, it takes several years, and you can pull it off because your model, which now is in a computer, matches exactly the reality out there. For global, the idea is actually what we're building is maps, right? So you guys all have maps, and you've got several maps of the same physical reality, and you recognize that maps are constructed with a purpose, and the map is good or not good in terms of how well it gets you to your purpose, right? So if you're trying to drive, you get a map that's got roads on it. And of course, you recognize when you look at a map that every one of those roads, particularly a map of Canada, those roads are like kilometers wide. But that doesn't matter because it still gets you from point A to point B. And if you're trying to go orienteering through the wilderness, you want a topo map that's got lines on it. And so for these people, they say, you know what, there is an objective reality. There's various ways to try to construct maps of it, and that's a useful exercise. And the question that they ask is not what's true. The question is, how is the map I am using for this intellectual task at hand close enough to the reality that it's a useful map? So we can build that project, we don't go there. And then instrumentalism, before you tell me is there a truth or not a truth, I want to know, why do you want to know about truth? Right? Are you trying to get a rocket to the moon? Are you trying to decide what's right or wrong? Because they get to the fact that there is this reality that's hard to get there. So how close is your map, and is your map useful for the purpose that you've decided to have a map? So questions of origins and questions of after death, people with a global worldview may have very different ideas, partly because it's not developed enough to get there. But if someone from a global worldview and you say, what happens after death? The proper answer would be, well, something happens. We're not sure what. Why do you ask? And then let's go find the ideas about what happens after death that is most useful for solving the purpose that you want to get to. So for example, we're trying to build a country and we want to live at peace. What happens after death tends to separate us, so let's just not bother working on that problem because it's not useful. Something happens after death, but we can't get there. And same thing with origins. Well, why do you want to know? right? You want to know because you're trying to build a moral code? Well, then let's go with a religious account of origins. Because it's not entirely accurate, but it works for our purpose. Or if you're trying to put a rocket on the moon, let's go with a scientific version of origins. Again, it's not quite accurate, but it gets us to the moon, and so let's go with that. So they're just picking and choosing these based on what they want to get to. Morality, ethics. There is a common set of moral concerns, but that set's fairly small. There is a sense that every human being has a responsibility to help every other human being, right? We're a global planet, we're one Earth, we got to help each other, we've only got so much space, we've only got so much resources, and so what we ought to be working on is how to get along with each other and interact with each other. That's the task, and morality and ethics is all about how you get along with your neighbor. Let me get into, so that's global, and it's very superficial and short because we've only been working on it for 20 years. And some people don't even think it qualifies as a worldview. Biblical worldview, right? This is where we should be. Hopefully all of us are attempting to have a biblical worldview, and hopefully you've recognized that none of the worldviews we've talked about so far are biblical. Although you will see all of these worldviews reflected in theology, and you'll see all of these worldviews reflected in your churches, and you'll see all these worldviews reflected in pulpits. And people will certainly pick a worldview that they twist the way they want to match Christianity. It would be rather arrogant to say that any one of us can capture perfectly a Christian worldview. I mean, because to have a Christian worldview would be to perfectly have the mind of Christ and to see the world as he sees it. And if you think you can get there in your lifetime, then you have no hope of getting there because the sin of arrogance and pride is firmly rooted in who you are. So we should, however, not abandon that project, right? Because that's my central project as a Christian is to become like Christ. So what's Christ's view of the world? How does he see the world and the realities that are there? So let's tackle our 5 topics from a biblical worldview. History. So one of our limitations is our ability to see fully the world as Christ sees it. And one of those limitations is because we're creatures of time, right? We are in a time and in a culture, and our view is there. Scripture makes it fairly clear that God's been involved in revealing more and more of himself to humanity through the course of human history. There's a meta-narrative. God is working things out. And so your sense of history is there. So one of the things we do as we construct a biblical worldview is acknowledge that it's going to be incomplete, and tomorrow they may have something even better. Question of origins. We're created beings in a created world. So in some sense, we agree with the modernity. There's not natural and supernatural. There's merely creator and the created. Right? God doesn't do the supernatural. When God does stuff, he's messing with nature, which he created, and it's perfectly natural that he can do that. Right? There's nothing supernatural really about what God does, because there's nothing above nature. There is God and there is nature. In a biblical worldview, that's the only split that's there, and the purpose of creation was for relationship with God and each other and creation. Right? So that's where we came from. We were created. Morality and ethics. So again, there's some themes. Scripture, when it deals with morality, has themes. The first is that there is good and evil. Now, not good and evil for the modern person in terms of law and justice. There is God, which is good, and that which is separate and inconsistent with him is evil. Right? From a biblical point of view, that's how you define good and evil. And our task is to grow closer to him and thus become good like him, and that process is justification and restoration, and he's invited us to be part of that process. So that process is hopefully happening in us, and we're invited to be part of that process as it happens in others. And you can tell how far you or others have come by looking for the character traits of God in them, right? Which is the fruits of the Spirit. Ultimate meaning. Ultimate meaning is found in being what God intended us to be, right? What did the Creator create me for? What is good and how do I pursue that? And that may look a little different in all of us, but the ultimate meaning is to be there. And then after death, the process of restoration in relationship is complete. Right? Our task is to be restored in relationship, and then once we get there, that happens after death, that it's complete. So how do your classmates and you get a worldview? And we'll move through these bubbles very quickly. And how do you move somebody from the worldview that they have to a Christian worldview? And how do you move yourself from the cultural worldview that you inherited to a Christian worldview? So where does it come from? Leadership of self and others is focused on bringing about change. So there was a time when worldview came from sacred texts, right? That's where it would come from. Not so much anymore. Culture, education, family, social norms drive that a lot more. And experience begins to change that. You know, when you're 2, you think that things are red and shiny, are fun to play with until you touch the stove, and then your worldview changes. Red and shiny has a different significance. If you believe that we've got a base personality, then your base personality affects your worldview. Certainly, most of you can't find the theology department in your university, but you can probably find the philosophy department. And so the sacred texts have disappeared and philosophy has replaced it. And certainly the media plays a huge role in how our culture mediates things. And then the behavior and experience starts to interact. So this is the process by which somebody who starts off ends up getting a worldview. Now the problem is that most of this, I would argue, is well underway and almost finished by 10, 12 years of age. That's all figured out. So your classmates are well beyond that. Sometimes it may not feel that way, but I can tell you that they are beyond that stage. Where are my marker here? Oh, here we go. So, by 10 or 12 years of age, the arrows tend to flip a little bit. Worldview becomes pretty insular. So most of your classmates who are in their 20s are actually interpreting all of these things from their worldview. So at some point in your adolescence, when you start to take information in, that information and those experiences don't shape your worldview anymore. Your worldview allows you to interpret and make sense of them, right? So you hear something in the news, or one of your classmates says something, or a professor says something, you have an experience. Your first thought is not, I need to re-understand how the world works. Your first thought is, how do I make sense of this? And you're making sense of it according to how you think the world works. You flip the arrows around, which is why it's actually quite hard to change somebody's worldview, because it's pretty insulated, right? Everything you say, as Dana was saying this morning, they've got to make sense of you. You're a nice person. Okay, I understand nice people. That makes sense. How do you do that? And what ends up happening is your worldview is driving choices and driving experience, and it all works quite well together. And if you have an experience, you need to make a choice. It all fits together nicely. And what ends up changing that is when something doesn't fit. Some experience, some knowledge hits, and you can't make it all fit together. Facing the possibility that your worldview is wrong means facing the prospect that you've lived a lie, all your choices are incorrect, and you must radically change the way you live your life. Right? Which when you're 3, is fine, because you haven't got a lot at stake. When you're in your 30s, that's a huge thing to face, the possibility that you have been completely wrong about everything that is important. So what happens is you have an experience, or you get a bit of knowledge that you can't make sense of. You can't fit your experience and your worldview together. Something's happened that makes no sense at all. And what I need to do is I either need to change my worldview, or I need to find another way to explain the experience. Either my worldview is wrong, or I didn't have the experience I thought I had. Because I can't put the two together. Which, as we've said, facing that means facing a huge emotional upset. So, if you, as we've talked about all this, are thinking, you know what? I see strains of modernity in myself. I see strains of postmodernity in myself. I'm even a little bit global. And some of this Christian stuff, it doesn't fit together. How do you go about changing? Well, what you go about changing is you go about putting yourself in situations where experience gaps happen. Where do experience gaps happen? Experience gaps happen if you are spending time in God's Word, and coming across things that you can't put together and make sense of, and honestly wrestling with that. Living in a Christian community where you're bumping into other people, working with Christians who are more mature in the faith, and pursuing God's will for your life. And you'll find if you honestly do that, every now and again you come across a situation where it doesn't make sense, and it's really unsettling, and God's using that to say, you know what, this bit of your understanding is incorrect. You ought to be seeing it this way. And it takes a fair amount of courage to live that way, because it's an awful lot of work. Now, if you're doing that, your behavior will be quite different than those around you, and you become an experience gap. Your existence cannot be explained. So, somebody interacts with you, and they're postmodern, and truth is relative, and you do whatever makes you happy, and then you're going about believing in an absolute truth and self-sacrificing, and yet you seem to be happy. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because those that believe in absolute truth are just the crazy, uneducated people, and they've got something they're trying to sell me. Except this classmate that sits next to me is way happier with life than I am, and he's succeeding, and he seems to be reasonably intelligent, and he actually gets better marks on exams than I do, and yet he believes in absolute truth. I can't make any sense of that, because everybody knows that absolute truth is like fairies, and he doesn't believe in fairies, and he believes in absolute truth. So they've got to put you together somehow. You've become the experience gap. So they got to figure out you're either crazy, you're lazy, you're stupid, you're wrong. They got to find something to make you disappear, because otherwise they're in trouble. Bonhoeffer once said, and I love this quote, that if you have an encounter with who Christ truly is, either you die or he must. And I'm paraphrasing. And I think what he was getting to is the idea that if you confront the Christian worldview, either your worldview must die, or you got to find some way to eliminate the Christian worldview. When you truly encounter Christ and who he is, you both can't continue to exist, because that experience gap is just too jarring. If Christ is truly who he said he was, then you've got to align with him, or you've got to eliminate him. There's no other option there. So that's the end of what we prepared for this session. It's about 10 minutes for Q&A. So we'll take a couple questions if we have time, and Mark's going to join me up here. This is how you get a hold of us, and those of you who are online can certainly email, and we can carry on the conversation.
You're absolutely right. It was purely time.
Yeah.
For Dan and I to really do this justice, you'd almost have to do a week on comparative religion study. But that's a totally legit point. Like that, there's other faith systems out there. We happen to choose these ones, and the religious one we chose was the Judeo-Christian worldview. Yeah, but you're right though.
It's interesting though that when you interact with classmates of other faiths, sometimes you'll find that they have a worldview consistent with their faith, and sometimes you'll find that they have a modern or postmodern worldview with their faith sort of tacked on. And that counts for Christians too, right? You'll come across lots of Christians who are modern in their worldview, and they've got Christianity tacked on. So I would say that when you're interacting with a classmate who claims to come from a religious worldview, that's not enough to yet understand where they're coming from. Because once you've, even if you have a religious affiliation, if you're in a dominant culture long enough, you'll tend to look like the dominant culture, even though you may dress a little differently. So, yeah.
With respect to Islam in particular, those conversations are amazing to get into if you can. All right? Do a bit of preparation beforehand, because do not underestimate the capacity of your average Muslim to poke huge holes in the Christian faith. But after having talked to a few of my colleagues and stuff like that, a lot of the issues brought up are the same ones, and you can actually think about them ahead of time. Don't be ashamed to get into these conversations with your peers, all right? Don't think that you're going to bring somebody to Christ with it. It's not like they're going to throw up their hands, oh man, you're right, let's go to church. Do you know what I mean? That won't happen. However, though, it's amazing how many times I've gotten into those discussions, and of course a person didn't come to Christ, a Muslim brother, a friend of mine, right? However, though, it's amazing how many people have been sitting around and listening, all right? And are saying, boy, Mark, I'm glad you were able to, have an answer for that. You know what I mean? So don't be afraid. And the goal of the conversation often is not to, you know what I mean? It's other reasons why, and sometimes you walk away from it feeling like you quote unquote lost, all right? But it doesn't matter, okay? Because that's what leads you where? Back to Scripture. Do you know what I mean? To go over it again and make sure you know why what you believe. So it's good things.
And you'll also notice that, I mean, we present these as distinct things, and in your classmates, it is not. It's amazing how many of them, when they're wearing the white coat, they're modern.
Totally.
When they're making decisions about what them and their girlfriend can do on Friday nights, they're postmodern.
You see what I mean?
And they're picking and choosing.
And Christianity is different from those things. I mean, a good way to think about it is this: is religious and philosophical worldviews often come at sort of three levels. All right, it'll either be based on knowledge, know these things. Do you know what I mean? And that's the way to go. Once you master this knowledge, right, Joe? We were talking about this before we came. The other one was based on the existential, like experience, life experience. If you experience these things, that will bring you to truth. So number one, through knowledge. Then other people come through experience. And other ones, worldviews will come in a very practical way. Do these things. Live these things out. Islam is very much like that. You know what I mean? And that's the way to go. Christianity doesn't fit into any of those things. It's distinctive. Take the first one, knowledge, right? Christ didn't come only to bring us knowledge of God. He came as God. Do you know what I mean? Think of experience. Christ didn't only come to bring us a new experience of God, even though there's no other way to experience God through knowing Him. Again, He was God. Practical. Christ didn't come only to exhort us to good works, even though He said that's how we should be known. Do you know what I mean? What I'm trying to get at is Christianity is not rooted in knowledge or experience or in practically doing things. It's rooted in being. It's rooted in Christ Himself. It's what we call ontologic, all right? So not epistemological, which is knowledge, not existential, which is experience, not pragmatical, which is how to do things, but in ontology, Christ being. You know what I mean? So it is distinct, but anyway.
And the classic example for that is when the lawyer came to Christ and said, what are the greatest command, right? He was looking for knowledge. He's a lawyer. And Jesus, well, what do you think? I love how he answered with questions. And the guy said, well, you love God and love your neighbor. Christ said, very good, carry on. And of course, that wasn't enough for him. He said, well, who's my neighbor, right? Give me knowledge. And what was Christ's answer? Christ's answer was, no, go be a neighbor, right? Not who's my neighbor. No, I want you to go be a neighbor. And which gets to this idea, which drives, of course, the modern, postmodern, drives them all crazy, and Christianity is not fundamentally about knowledge or ethics or all those things. It's about who you ought to be, and then take it from there.
Based on who Christ is.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That's a great question. Islam is,
Yeah.
Okay, so if you think of baseball and three umpires, okay? One is a pre-modern umpire, the other one is a modern umpire, and the other one is a postmodern umpire, okay? The pre-modern umpire says, there's balls and there's strikes, and I call them, wait, hold on a sec here. Have you guys heard this before? Okay, wait.
Okay. Yeah, balls and their strikes.
And I calls them as they are. That's the pre-modern one. The modern umpire says there's balls and there's strikes and I call them like I see them. And the postmodern umpire says there ain't nothing till I call them. You see what I mean? So those would be the three umpires.
So for the pre-modern, a ball or strike exists. It is. And it's
he calls them as they are.
He just says that this is how it is. Right? This is Plato. Whereas the modern one says they exist, but I have to figure them out. So my function is to discover them, and in the discovering, become aware of them. And of course, for the postmodern, there isn't until I choose to look for it. It doesn't exist.
I used to think, I didn't say it, so give me 1 minute here. I was sort of thinking about the relationship between modernism and postmodernism, and I used to think that postmodernism was purely a rebellion against modernism. But I'm not so sure. I've been thinking about it more, and I'm starting to wonder now whether postmodernism is simply the natural evolution of modernism. It's sort of modernism gone to seed, all right? It's sort of this. If your understanding of knowledge, like a modernist, is empiric, do you guys know what that means? Again, come back to medicine. What does it mean if I diagnose and treat pneumonia empirically? Have you heard that term? Right? That means this. Somebody comes in and you're going to use the 5 senses. You're going to listen to their chest. You're going to feel their head. You know what I mean? You're going to look at them to see if they're sick. And then based on that, you will prescribe something. That's empiric treatment. Okay? No x-rays and blood work. That's not empiric. Okay? So if you treat a disease empirically, you use it based on the 5 senses. So whenever you hear that now, you know what it means. Okay? Empiric therapy. Okay? So if your understanding of knowledge, like a modernist, is empiric, right? And you see that the only things that are actually knowable are things that you can observe with the 5 senses and through science, right? That would be an empiric understanding. That would be what they would term an empiric epistemology. Your understanding of knowledge, episteme is knowledge. Your understanding of knowledge is empiric. What will you quickly find out? You will find out that science and the 5 senses can't tell us some things. In fact, they can't tell us some of the most important things to us. What scientific experiment could you do to prove that something is just? Do you see what I mean? Or to prove that something is good? There is no empiric way of testing those things. So if you embrace that as a modernist, you will come to see that, holy smoke, there's a whole bunch of things that I can't answer. Therefore, it's a short step over to postmodernism. Do you see what I mean? The understanding is that since I can't know them, they're not real and knowable. Therefore, everything is relative. Do you see what I mean? So it's almost like modernism gone to seed, you get to postmodernism. And we have it now. That understanding of knowledge exists. Let's say there's a hot button issue that we're talking about. Let's say assisted suicide. And you get a panel of experts together. You get a doctor, a teacher, a lawyer, you know what I mean, a professor, and you get a pastor, right? Automatically in public, whose opinion counts the least? The pastor's, okay? Because we all have internalized almost this empiric understanding of knowledge. That's nice, Pastor Pete, that you could come out. Now on to you, Dr. So-and-so. Do you see what I mean? Because we've almost internalized that there are some things that we really can't know. And it's just really just opinion and story. You know what I mean? So that's why I'm wondering if in a lot of ways, modernism is just postmodernism taken to the end. You know what I mean? But anyway. Yeah.